So recently, Braxton Hunter, who has a YouTube channel called Trinity Radio, put out a list of questions for atheists. Now, several people have already responded, but many gave spontaneous answers as they watched. And while this candid approach is valuable in its own right, I think my more scripted approach should bring something new to the table. There's a lot of opportunity here to discuss common issues with how Christians view the conversation about belief and non-belief, as well as the role they expect their specific supernatural propositions to play in that conversation. So I hope you still find something useful in my more premeditated deep dive into this. With that, here goes.
The worldview discussions space can be so combative. And when atheists and Christians come up with lists of questions that they don't think the other side can answer, those questions usually aren't genuine. I've never made a list like that, although I've responded to some. Here, I hope my atheist interlocutors will consider these questions deeply without giving glib answers. These aren't meant to be gotcha questions, though I'm not asking for no reason. I expect you will have answers, and I want to hear what the most sincere among you have to say. With that, here are my 10 questions for atheists.
Now, for some quick context, I recently made some lists of questions for Christians. In doing so, I went out of my way to condemn a gotcha attitude. To be clear, the questions should be treated as open-ended conversation starters, and to implore my audience to use the opportunity to listen rather than trying to back Christians into corners. And here it seems that Braxton, after responding to some of those videos, seems to be taking a similar tact with similar verbiage, so I want to treat his questions in good faith. However, he often does come on pretty strong with insinuations that certain atheist stances are inevitably disingenuous, and that we use various forms of posturing to cover for weaknesses in our perspective. I don't take this as willful malice, and in fairness, some of my questions may have implied similar things about deep-seated mental shortcuts Christians might use. I guess some of this can be a little inevitable when discussing deep-seated differences of opinion. So while not admitting we're equals in this regard, I'm just going to call it a wash and try to steer a course between not going after his motives while still being very direct about addressing some of his more unconstructive statements. Also, one final note, this quick sequence runs between each of his questions. And since I really don't want to listen to 10 times and can't imagine you want to either, I'm just going to cut that out. That will be the only substantial edit I make to his material.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning. So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Now, the first thing we have to do before answering this question is clarify which worldview I hold that we're contrasting to Christianity. Braxton makes a legitimately good move by acknowledging that atheism itself is not a worldview, because my lack of belief in God is not my worldview any more than Braxton's presumed lack of belief in vampires is his worldview. Rather, our rejections of these specific claims just incidentally follow from broader worldviews that help shape our framework for evaluating evidence. So what is my worldview? If I had to quickly label it, at least for the sake of discussing how I account for facts, I would call it methodological naturalism. Meaning I think the only way to arrive at reliable, broadly agreed upon facts is by observing the world around us while confining our understanding of reality to the body of natural patterns observed so far. Now, this makes answering this question tricky, because while atheism clearly separates me from Christians, methodological naturalism does not. Most Christians, consciously or not, arrive at most of their knowledge the same way I do. Whatever religious beliefs they have, they simply couldn't survive unless they interacted intelligently with the world as it presents itself to them. and as long as they do, their method of arriving at truth overlaps with mine. Where I broadly disagree with Christians is when they start believing things based on faith, theological assumptions, or adherence to doctrine. As far as these methods account for concepts like morality and purpose, it's only by pulling assumptions from thin air and defining them as answers. And as far as they account for things such as the spread of the early church or miracle claims, it's only by providing quick, easy answers to phenomena that have possible and I'd argue likely natural explanations, thus stopping short of more meaningful, fact-based exploration of the topics. Now, the unique methodology of Christianity can account for many things well, if by that you mean neatly and conclusively, but if you mean accurately and verifiably, that's another story altogether. So our shared worldview of methodological naturalism is the only thing that accounts for facts we actually agree on, and whenever Christianity departs from it, it's using questionable methods to arrive at conclusions we don't agree on, making discussion of them a departure from the premise of the question. When it comes down to it, I don't care how many things a Christian or an atheist can account for. To account for something is just to put an explanation into words, and that's not an accomplishment. What I care about is the method by which someone arrives at an explanation. So unless someone can describe a reliable, uniquely Christian method of arriving at conclusions that are unique to the Christian faith, then I don't see how this question means much.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God? After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist. And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
No, I don't think it sounds disingenuous at all, because I, at least, don't see a tremendous difference between lacking belief in something, disbelieving in something, and believing something doesn't exist. In most cases, each phrase describes a very similar reaction to a proposition, and in fact I would challenge you to describe a clear, substantial distinction between them, especially when discussing something you don't believe in. Sure, you can definitively say you believe something isn't true if it can be proven false, for example that there are physical gods living at the top of Mount Olympus, but what about propositions that can't necessarily be proven false, but are either so unlikely, incongruent with reality as you've seen it so far, or apparently made up, that they can be reasonably dismissed as absurd? Would you say that you simply lack belief in these, or that you believe they don't exist? Both these phrases are pretty interchangeably used to describe people's reactions to most unusual phenomena. So the important thing is to understand what the reaction is, not exactly how you label it. See, we've all encountered countless supernatural or unusual claims, either directly or through general cultural osmosis, and our usual reaction is to unconsciously ignore them, setting them aside in the corner of our minds and going about our daily lives interacting with evident reality. In the unlikely event that one of these presents us with compelling evidence, then we'll see. But until then, they're a waste of time. Not only is this reasonable, but it's a vital sorting process if we're to live a functional life without chasing down endless rabbit holes. But the problem is, each of these propositions is somebody's favorite, and to them, the dismissing it as absurd stance feels like a cop-out. When you immerse yourself in an unsubstantiated claim, it starts to feel so pivotal that you think everybody else in the world should prove it wrong, or at least precisely define the response to it. And when Christians do this persistently enough, non-believers will often throw up their hands and say, okay, I just lack belief. We don't make this concession for Santa belief because Santa believers don't grow into apologists, refine their concept of Santa to make it less falsifiable, and then press us to split hairs over what we mean by not believing it. It seems that Braxton sees a contrast between Santa and God in this regard, because for him Santa more easily slides into the reasonably dismissed as absurd category since he views it from the outside. But seeing both from the outside, I recognize the distinction as illusory.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
Okay, so one thing we need to address is this phrasing, when atheism becomes part of someone's worldview. Since atheism is just disbelief in a proposition, it would be more accurate to say, when belief in gods is no longer part of your worldview. This might sound like nitpicking, but it actually brings a lot more clarity to what we're talking about and helps us avoid confusion caused by poorly framed questions. By default, you as a well-adjusted adult will just go about your business interacting with evident reality. From there, once the idea of God is introduced, you're faced with a choice, which is to start believing in an invisible deity and considering it an additional factor in your decision-making process or not. Atheism is just where you don't, and when you don't, you just continue going about your business living according to evident reality. To describe atheism as something that becomes part of your worldview muddies the issue by making it sound like one of two possible outside factors you can introduce into this process, and it's not. It's just removing something questionable from the process. So when people leave the faith, all they're doing is removing God as a decision-making factor, which means they no longer define morals based on poorly evidenced impressions of what he wants. At this point, it will only make sense for them to start forming and justifying their idea of what's moral based on the evident reality of how their actions impact others. Now yes, I can see how Christians get the message from this that atheists just want to sin, but the fact that they do is frankly their problem. If a religion has a set of rules that can't be justified outside religious dictate, that's problematic in and of itself. If its followers can't get their minds around why it's natural for those outside their religion to not follow those rules, that's an even bigger problem of inability to see where their religion fits in the big picture. As with many things, this becomes obvious if you just change which religion you're talking about. So let's imagine a Muslim converted to Christianity. Now, maybe he didn't just want to justify a haram lifestyle, but could you see how his decision to eat pork and marry an infidel might send that message to Muslims? Maybe. But I think we could all pretty clearly see this as a perception problem with Islam rather than an issue with Christianity. At any rate, this is really a crass generalization anyway. Not all atheists feel the same way about prostitution or are hoping for the kids to have sex before marriage. They come up with varied, nuanced reactions to these topics, which is a healthy sign that they're thoughtfully considering them instead of just repeating dictates from a religious tradition. For my part, after I left the faith, it took me a long time to fully get my mind around the idea of many sinful behaviors being okay. And to this day, I'm still a pretty low-key guy who sins less spectacularly than a lot of Christians. I mean, I guess I blaspheme a lot more, but even that took some getting used to and certainly wasn't something that would tempt me away from the faith. So if you get the impression that, for example, my support of the LGBTQ community arises from my desire to commit sins I don't partake in, rather than, advocacy based on my sense of justice, it's almost like you're trying to walk away with that message.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief, as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
To be frank, this is a really bizarre question. Like I said before, we're faced with all kinds of unusual claims, and we generally just set them aside in the corner of our minds and don't believe them, which is natural and totally fine. So if you can't be expected to parse out lack of belief versus believing it's not true for each of them, consider how much more difficult it is to quantify, even approximately, how likely you think one of them is. It would involve putting a lot of undue mental energy into evaluating the fine details of something we just don't find believable. And even if we decided that's how we wanted to spend our time, most of us aren't statisticians and have no clue how to assign even crude percentage likelihoods to complex propositions. Now, I'm sure Braxton wasn't expecting us to put precise calculations into our answer. But still, even asking someone to decide whether they think an unbelief claim is 50-50, 40-60, or 30-70 likely is usually splitting some pretty fine hairs over the fact that they just don't believe it, and any number they give will probably just be pulled out of the hat as a crude reiteration of the fact that they don't believe you. Think about it. Can you assign a percentage to how likely you consider a story of a UFO abduction? Of someone's amazing performance from their glory days in high school football? of the biggest fish they ever caught? Some of these could get hard to assign any sort of percentage to, especially considering that you're evaluating details as well as the overarching claim, and even if the UFO one is, say, 90% unlikely, would you then want to sit there and do the lack of belief versus believe it's not true thing with someone who's pressing you to prove them wrong if you choose the second, and then consider you disingenuous depending on how you sift through all this messy detail? This is just one of a few instances in which Braxton should have been much slower to bring up words like disingenuous. Now, I don't think he does this out of combativeness. He probably just needs to manage his expectation of how thoroughly people flesh out their reaction to his personal religion.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those? It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism. My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this: when you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit? It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
Braxton's phrasing here is just dripping with insinuation. I won't go so far as to call it a veiled gotcha, but he seems to be hinting we have nothing left, or are at least in a really tight spot, once we set aside our talking points and get out of debate mode, as if we're using scripted tools to put up a wall when confronted by a huge weakness in atheism. But there is no weakness here for one obvious reason, which is that not knowing something about the universe isn't a weakness. It just means we haven't learned enough to come up with an answer, and, if we're approaching the problem intelligently, we're waiting until we learn enough before declaring we have an answer. See, when he says atheists have a massive blind spot at the origin of the universe, he's technically correct. But that's because we all have a massive blind spot there, because we don't have actual verifiable knowledge about it. This is another instance where it will help to clarify that atheism is not something that's added to a worldview. Atheism just means you don't add God to your understanding of the world. So when theists do add God to the question of the universe's origins, they're just throwing in a guess where we all have a blind spot. And I wouldn't exactly call that a weakness for us. Not knowing this doesn't destabilize us, because we don't need the false sense of stability that comes from easy, simplified answers. Looking back to question 1, this illustrates the difference between being able to account for something versus approaching it with sound methodology. Yes, Christianity can account for the origin of the universe, if by that you mean it can put an answer into words. And yes, it accounts for it well, if by that you just mean the answer is neat and conclusive. But how did they get this answer? That's the trick, right? Deducing that God caused the origin of the universe is no less error-prone than an ancient person deducing that God caused lightning. Sure, an ancient atheist might have had a blind spot about how lightning works, but which of the two comes off better in hindsight? Braxton actually did something pretty revealing when laying out the possible options. If you look back, you'll see he included 1. God, 2. Past infinite regress, 3. The universe coming uncaused out of nothing, and 4. Something less clear than even those. In doing so, he unwittingly presented the best option, which is number 4. The answer is less clear to us right now because of how little we actually know, and we should acknowledge that lack of clarity instead of just making up an answer because we feel destabilized.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
You know, I really don't like this question. I mean, I can see where it comes from, and I don't fault Braxton for asking it, but the fact of the matter is, I'm not aware of an argument that makes me consider theism at all. And I hate that answer because it sounds closed-minded. But it's my honest answer, and I really don't think it is closed-minded. Because do we need to be able to identify a convincing argument for every supernatural proposition that comes our way in order to be open-minded? To help see what I mean, just ask yourself, which argument most makes you consider the possibility that the Earth is flat, or that the Cottingley fairies are real? you might not be able to identify an argument that makes you consider either. And if that's the case, it's not your fault. Just as there might not be sufficient evidence to make you believe them, there might also not be sufficient evidence to make you consider them. So you shouldn't feel pressure to name an argument that makes you consider something you haven't found worth considering. I'd bet theists, looking in from the outside, can clearly see how this is fair for other propositions, and while they may think theirs is better evidence than the rest, they should have the self-awareness to recognize that they're looking at their proposition from the inside, and to recognize that everybody thinks their supernatural proposition is better evidence than the rest. That said, while no argument drives me to consider theism, I do find many theistic arguments interesting. Christians have spent a lot of time weaving them, so untangling them is an interesting mental exercise. And in the process of discovering where theism takes mental shortcuts on various topics, I'm forced to think more deeply on those topics than I otherwise ever would have. In this light, the arguments I found most interesting have probably been moral arguments and, more recently, any line of argumentation that treats abstractions as things that exist necessarily outside material reality. Our thoughts can feel like ethereal things swimming around in our heads, so they're one of the easiest things to misunderstand, and thus one of the last refuges of apologetics.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists, or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you? Do you know? And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
Okay, so let's first address what Braxton seems to be presenting as a double standard, which is that we admit we're not absolutely certain of anything, yet we demand a demonstration of God's existence and then won't even accept the reasons they give when they present them. But, okay, hear me out. Maybe the reasons Christians give aren't good. The simple fact that you gave reasons for believing a supernatural proposition doesn't obligate people to find those reasons compelling. Nor does the not being absolutely certain thing make your belief in God equal to other people's belief in other things. Sure, if you dig deep enough and start appealing to solipsistic arguments, you can nitpick your way to the point of saying none of us have absolute certainty about anything. But that doesn't mean we can't have more functional certainty about some things than others. I mean, I see humans around me every day. I notice patterns in how they behave and how my actions impact them, and they make up such an obvious part of my existence that they're pretty hard to deny. So a lot of my choices revolve around living alongside them. However, if, for example, I'd never seen another human, I wouldn't start buying more groceries and setting extra places at the dinner table just because I encountered a cosmological argument for my children. In the same way, if God regularly manifested as an obvious part of my reality, I'd respond to him accordingly. But I won't, nor should I, pattern my life around what people tell me about him just because they presented me with a line of apologetics arguments. The plain fact is, denying reality as it persistently presents itself to you is not the same as being unconvinced by people's attempts at deducing their way to things you've never observed. Of course, because we don't find the arguments compelling, Braxton asked the all-too-common question, what kind of evidence would be enough for you? I find the question itself to be somewhat problematic. To see why, imagine that ufologists and cryptozoologists and members of all other religions, and literally everybody else who put forth a supernatural claim, all came at you demanding you answer this question about their favorite proposition. Seriously, take a moment and try to actually visualize what it would be like. The first thing you'd probably notice is how overwhelming it would be. There are reasons that every time we encounter a supernatural claim, we don't take it upon ourselves to fully wrap our minds around it and then decide, in purely hypothetical terms, exactly what kind of and how much evidence we need to start believing it. One of the most obvious being that we just wouldn't get much else done. Now, when you're inside one of these belief systems, then sure, you think yours is special and deserves that much of everybody's consideration. But everybody else thinks theirs is just as special, just as compelling, and just as deserving of consideration. So if you can take a step back and look at them all from the outside and see how they're all clamoring for our attention, then you'll realize how unintentionally presumptuous it is to expect others to engage this deeply with their unproven claim. And yes, since the premise of this question is how much evidence would be enough, we see that they recognize most outsiders don't consider their claim thoroughly demonstrated. So this is what they're asking of people. But you can't expect everybody else to be so interested in your supernatural proposition that they design your strategy for convincing them.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
Oh, wow, okay. So Braxton pretty heavily insinuates that it's feelings about moral issues rather than all this talk about evidence that leads Christians to atheism. But that's not my experience at all. Over several years as a Christian, I slowly started to recognize that there was no good reason to believe in God, and I saw with ever-growing clarity not only the inadequacy of the reasons I had been given, but the mechanisms I and other Christians use to make God unfalsifiable and to explain away our doubts. And once I finally admitted to myself that I didn't believe, it took me time to reevaluate why things are actually right and wrong, to overcome my religiously ingrained biases towards certain actions and people, and to fully adjust my perspective on behaviors I had previously thought were sins. So yes, in spite of what Braxton is implying, it was about evidence for me, and far from running from Christianity toward a new perspective on social issues, I kept trying to run to Christianity until I had to be honest with myself about whether my belief was justified. This seems to be the case for many atheists, probably the majority of them that I've encountered. So until they can get their heads around this, apparently decent, well-intentioned Christians like Braxton are going to have issues communicating with the atheists they're trying to reach out to. Not only does his framing of this question imply a certain level of intellectual dishonesty on our part, but it trivializes the attachment we had to Christianity and the often painful process we went through leaving it.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos? And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
This is another question I have trouble with because it successfully makes me feel guilty on some level for the fact that I haven't read a bunch of top-notch books by theists, much less read 3 of them recently. But I really don't think it's fair for me to feel guilty for a couple reasons. First, my channel is not about owning the best theistic arguments, as much as it is helping former or doubting Christians digest things they've heard from preachers and apologists during their time in the faith. And the fact of the matter is, most of what they heard came from over the pulpit. So I don't see why I shouldn't just address this material for what it is without referring to other written material that most Christians have never been exposed to. Second, there are a lot of far-fetched ideas out there, and most of them have throngs of believers who all think their idea is so special that everybody should feel compelled to read the best books about it. But the fact of the matter is, the average person doesn't have time to do this. I mean, what's the last top-notch book you've read about UFO abductions? Bigfoot? Ghost sightings? The list of phenomena could go on forever, meaning you could spend the rest of your life reading badly written books about nonsense and still be accused by someone else of dismissing their idea without reading the best literature on it. And this is setting aside an additional problem, which is that you can't even get away with reading just one book on a specific topic. Because what happens when you read the copy of The Case for Christ your aunt gave you? A friend from church will give you Cold Case Christianity and say you can't dismiss Christianity until you've read this one. And once you've read that, your parents give you evidence that demands a verdict, and on it goes. But the fact is, you aren't obligated to read books before not believing in something. Believers are obligated to explain why their idea is compelling enough that you should devote the time needed to read an entire book about it. Of course, I know this is different for me because I actively address Christianity, so I can see there being more onus on me to understand it. But part of the same idea still applies. I understand Christianity very well from 30-plus years spent deeply immersed in the faith, and have actively sought out the best arguments for Christianity both as a Christian and an atheist. The fact that I haven't fully read a lot of theistic books in the process is not a reflection of my diligence. It's a reflection of the fact that I haven't encountered any apologist or apologetic idea that compelled me to invest the time in reading an entire book. Honestly, I find that apologetics just keeps repeating the same pedestrian things over and over and over in slightly different words, so until I hear something better, picking up a book and spending hours experiencing the same thing in a more drawn-out format doesn't feel like a good use of my time. Short-form presentations like videos are people's opportunity to concisely express their best points. So when an apologist uses this format to show me arguments full of shortcuts and obvious specious reasoning, why should my next logical step be to dive into their book? One final issue with this question is knowing what Braxton considers a properly academic book and also who he considers a theistic author. Considering these are two moving goalposts depending on the theist you're talking to, this is kind of a hard thing to satisfy all Christians about. This is especially true of a purely arbitrary field like theology that has no clear methodology and no objective body of facts. It seems like this question is implied to be a measure of how well we understand and are addressing theistic arguments. But if someone sees a weakness in my arguments, then why not just address them for what they are? And if they have good points to make, why not show me what those points are instead of just chiding me for not reading enough books? Media is changing anyway, and arguments are being presented in enough formats that books, while they have room to go into more depth, aren't the be-all and end-all anyway. That all said, this question does make me want to power through a couple of the most highly recommended ones just to say I did and maybe get people off my back. It's also worth pointing out that this question cuts both ways, because I would be curious to ask apologists like Braxton which 3 top-notch scholarly works on cosmology and astrophysics they most recently read before deducing that God was the best explanation for the universe.
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today to your satisfaction that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Lists like these very often end with this question, as if to suggest that the whole thing just might not be about evidence anyway. Because if we answer no, that must mean the core issue is more one of obedience than belief. But that doesn't follow at all, and this is an extremely bizarre question when you think about it. Whether someone exists and whether you should obey them are two totally separate issues, and the fact that Christians connect them shows how much existing theology sneaks into what are supposed to be objective logical arguments for God. I mean, just imagine someone came up to you and asked, if I can prove a really smart and powerful alien like Zorg exists, would you obey it and follow it? You'd probably recognize that this question is a non sequitur, and once the alien's existence were demonstrated, you would hopefully have all kinds of questions about what it's like and what it wants from you before deciding how you're going to respond to it. The same would go for any being, regardless of whether it had commonly been labeled as a god. Now yes, Christians might say, you already know all about God from the Bible, but this is rushing a lot of non-evidence assumptions into my process of learning about a being I had just discovered exists. I mean, if I were really seeking the truth based on evidence, wouldn't it only be healthy for me to get to know that being for myself? To discover if it was actually the God of the Bible? To clarify what it actually wants me to do with the Bible? And to ask questions about the contradictory and problematic parts of it? And by the way, to do all these things in real, verifiable communication, instead of praying into the empty air and trying to parse out the impressions that cross my mind? Only after doing this should I be expected to decide whether and to what extent I should follow the being. And this is all allowing for a very hypothetical case in which God had been shown to me in very clear, concrete terms. So just think about the level of allegiance Christians are asking us to promise a being that's only been demonstrated through what can very generously be called arguable lines of reasoning. They want us to follow what they claim it says, even to the point of assigning an archaic role of king over us, which when you think about it is a huge way to reconceptualize our relationship to anything. And in the actual or at least functional absence of that king, what these people are really asking us to do is assign them the archaic role of the kingdom's stewards. That's a big ask, and I'm not even willing to start considering obeying commands people pass down to me on the royal authority as someone they haven't even shown me exists. And if Christians think I should be expected to do that, that's a fundamental problem with them and their religion, not with me. Anyway, those were my answers. This program was made possible by a grant from Anthony Guthrie, John Adams, S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, The Crowd Pleaser, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.